if you look at, finance leaders' total profile, it's not only experience, but also that interpersonal dynamic component. But the stat, also that stood out to me is if you want to be a CFO, I think a lot of times we talk about what qualifiers do you need, what education do you need. When I looked at these CFOs, 84% of them were hired externally.
Welcome to the Breaking Into Finance podcast. Let's dive in. Hey everybody, today I am thrilled to have Eddie Ackerman on the show. Eddie is a strategic finance operating partner at Thomvest, and I'm thrilled to have Eddie on not only because he's a smart, insightful guy, but because he's going to help shed some light on a topic that, it's funny we haven't discussed yet. We've talked about all these exit opportunities. We've talked about investing. We've talked about various finance functions like FP&A, financial planning and analysis, but we haven't talked about the big one yet, being a CFO of a company. And so Eddie spends all of his time advising, working with, and in some cases being a CFO of some of Thomvest portfolio companies. And so thrilled to have Eddie on to talk about this among a variety of other topics. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Eddie. Eddie, thank you so much for taking the time to join me. Maybe just to kick it off, could you briefly introduce yourself and, your current role?
Sure. Yeah. First, Craig, just wanted to say thanks so much for having me on. I'm Eddie Ackerman, and I'm currently finance operating partner at Thomvest. So my background includes investment banking, which I think we share, leading finance at a Series B company, and being a finance leader at a private equity-backed company. My current role is really broken up into three different categories. The first area involves portfolio dropdowns, where I immerse myself in portfolio companies and manage finance operations as the company really seeks to bridge any gaps. So, for example, we had a portfolio company that recently had a VP of finance depart, and I dropped in for about 2 months to work with the CEO to do everything from the FP&A side of operations, but also to help focus on the strategic aspect of finance as well. The second part is really similar to the first part, and I'd list it as portfolio assistance. So this is where I do more of one-off activities and help unlock value within our portfolio. So, for example, I did a cost analysis exercise with one company and helped them save about $800K on their AWS bills. Another example would be helping with diligence during an acquisition. And lastly, one other thing I lump into this portfolio assistance category is materials to help founders and finance leaders. So I also founded US GASP, which is the generally accepted SaaS principles. So if many of you are familiar with GAAP, which I hope you are, it's similar in the sense that it lays foundation for the rules on ARR recognition. And then lastly, I mentioned there's three parts to this role. First two are really portfolio value enhancement focused. The last part is dealing with internal finance reporting. So everything from monitoring the performance of our portfolio to managing the financials from the companies that we receive, and then also tracking any costs associated. So almost treating the venture firm like its own startup. So monitoring and doing budget versus actuals. Everything like that falls under this third category. So a long explanation, but I'd say a unique-ish role. And so I wanted to give it the time it deserves there.
Yeah, and I know that the US GASP acronym is serious, but it's also hilarious. Just the world of non-GAAP things are very GASP inducing.
Yeah. No, the one thing I noticed is when I was running finance at a Series B company is any place where you give finance people options to exercise a little bit of managerial accounting, I think you need to put guardrails around that. And so,
Absolutely.
Dealing with a lot of startups, it's not necessarily a finance person who's making those managerial accounting decisions. It's founders, and wanted to give them, just like when you go bowling and you have those little rails, just want to have those little rails so they can get a strike every time.
That's great. And I want to talk more about, all components of that role, but I also want to just start by just level setting for folks a little bit about Thomvest.
Sure.
It's a little bit of a unique structure. If you could just talk a little bit about, the firm and how it came to be and how it operates?
Absolutely. So we definitely have a unique structure, and it's one that I really think favors the entrepreneur because we have one LP, and that's Peter Thompson from the Thomson Reuters family. The reason I say it favors the entrepreneur is because we never have to go out to the market and fundraise. So this means a few different things. First, since we're never fundraising, we're always focused on our portfolio companies and around to help. Second, along the same pane of glass, since we're never fundraising, we don't have to force entrepreneurs to sell at a time that's best for investors, but not founders. I think that's a key detail and something that's often overlooked when going with long-term capital versus someone who has to raise another fund. And then the last unique part of our structure is that because we have a single LP who can give us a thumbs up or thumbs down on any decisions, we're able to move very quickly. And the best example that comes to mind was during the SVB crisis, the bank was basically collapsing. All assets were frozen. A lot of CFOs were reaching out to us, and we basically had a triage desk of 30 plus CFOs reaching out saying, I don't think I can make payroll this week. I'm going to need help. This is a major issue. And so we were able to go to Peter and just and to explain the issue to him, say, hey, these companies are about to miss payroll due to a crisis. Can we set up a bank account so they have access and are able to make their payroll? And Peter just gave us a thumbs up. He said, absolutely. So within a few hours, we had an account that companies could pull on if they needed. Fortunately, major crisis was averted, but we did end up having one company that took us up on that offer. And so it's a unique structure because we didn't have to go through, committees and on committees internally. There's no, getting majority of LP rights or regulations. And so this structure of not having the fundraise and having direct answers, yes or no, I think is pretty unique. And so, working for Peter, our sole LP, and also even Don, who's head of our group here, they're both really passionate about the entrepreneur, focused on technology, and both really sharp guys who like autonomy. And so that's all you can really ask for from leaders and also a VC that's investing in you.
Yeah. And man, I mean, I know the Silicon Valley Bank crisis was sort of a one-off, but it's, I think, just a fascinating example for folks interested in finance too, how particularly in the startup world, there's all this focus on your P&L and specifically your revenue. And this is a balance sheet crisis, sheet crisis that is totally unrelated and foreign, I feel like, to folks who only, looked at one and not the other.
Yeah. And I also feel like everyone became a treasury expert in the course of about 2 days. Everyone knew you should have had your money in a money market off balance sheet. Like, why would you ever not?
Mm-hmm.
So I think it was a time that showed not only how fast things can change in startup land, but also the power of networks.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think one of the benefits and one of the things I saw was how strong of finance networks I have here in the Bay Area and in the startup world is you'd hear directly from the Fed, you'd get messages on, hey, I'm hearing this, X, Y, and Z. And so you're able to translate those and really help your portfolio companies in real time.
Any particularly surprising story or kind of weird thing that happened?
I think the weirdest thing that happened was we went from having 3 scheduled internal calls about, I guess, in the morning and then the evening. I would be fielding calls from about 30 CFOs, running a triage center of how much do they need, making sure we had the money in the bank to help them out, figuring out which payroll service provider they were. And then the government stepped in to prevent contagion, and then it just went silent.
Yeah.
And for me, that was the weirdest aspect is you went from 100 miles per hour to 0 miles per hour. And so I even emailed our team and just said, hey, like, is everything okay? And I was like, yeah, it's over. So for me, that was a unique situation and really interesting that you're just running, and then it's quiet and you feel like you should be doing something, but it's over.
I want to take a big kind of step out, zooming out now, just talking a little bit about your journey and how you found yourself where you are. So As you alluded, you started your career in investment banking at Deutsche Bank. I'd love to hear, I guess, first, a little bit about that experience, what you got out of it, whether you do it again.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think if you asked me when I was in investment banking, I'd probably say I would not do it again. But having the benefit of hindsight, I think it was one of the most important steps in my finance career. It taught me not only the foundation for strong modeling skills, digesting financials, but it also taught me the importance of hard work, rolling up your sleeves, and as we all know, pulling the late hours. And so, when I was sitting in the investment banking roles, considering next steps, what I should look for, and in part of the networking experience and reaching out to different folks, I ran into two guys who were leaving private equity to actually start their own company. And for me, that sounded like a pretty unique opportunity, mostly because I would get the tangential benefit of a private equity run company. And so we focused a lot on acquisitions, roll up strategy, which people might understand. But at the same time, got to get my hands dirty in an operating role, being the seventh employee at the company and basically first finance hire under the CFO. And for me, I jumped on that opportunity and really rolled up my sleeves. When you're at a company of seven with a fair amount of capital that you need to deploy, you pick things up very quickly. You wear multiple hats. So I did everything from internal financial modeling to probably did over 100 models on acquisition targets, 30 of which actually made it pretty far. I think we're used to some of those ratios where you spin your wheels a lot. Mm-hmm. But it was a really unique experience, built it, almost from the ground up. And I can chat more about my history and how I ended up where I was, but those were sort of the initial first steps into, I guess, finance leadership eventually.
Yeah, that's really cool. And then, yeah, I mean, I totally agree, honestly, with your framework on banking. I'm so glad I did it, but so glad I don't have to do it again.
Yep.
Is how I think about it. But I have a 1-year-old daughter, and there are a lot of things that I did that I hope she's smart enough not to do, but I will, pound the drum that I think banking right out of school is the
yeah.
first step.
It's funny because I also have a 1-year-old at home, and going into it, I asked a lot of friends, what is the experience like? And they were saying, oh, it's late hours, X, Y, and Z. And I said, okay, I've done that before in investment banking, so not too tough. This is a breeze. Not doing a model, instead just shaking or trying to coddle a baby to sleep. So significantly easier, in my opinion. So I guess I can add that to the list of benefits of investment banking.
There you go. Yeah,
prepares you for prepares you for fatherhood.
And then I guess the other thing that's like the let's call it the high status but worth investigating is the decision to go to the MBA. And so coming out of this kind of unique PE backed FP&A kind of like finance experience post banking, could you talk a little bit about decision to think about going back to grad school, and now that you're a few years removed from that decision, what that's meant for you and for your career?
Sure. Yeah, happy to explain it. So what I quickly realized in that PE-backed company, it was a natural resources company. So where you focus is primarily on operating costs. You try to acquire, cut operating costs, enhance value that way. And I want
was your investment banking group as well, right? Was also NR?
Yes, in natural resources as well. And so wanted to find an operating role where top line control played a little bit more of a prominent role. And where the underlying product, to be more frank, is more exciting. So after chatting with a few people, and I think that's a recurring theme, is you always reach out to a network, get people to opine on your path, but ultimately you make the decision. That's a little bit of a side note there. But after chatting with a few people who successfully pivoted out of that vertical that I was in, I realized the way to do that with the least amount of friction was to go to business school and use that as a stepping stone, not only from an educational perspective, but also from a network perspective, especially in the software industry. So went to Stanford GSB to get my MBA. And, given that my undergraduate degree is in accounting and finance, I tended to find more value in classes that taught me operational intelligence. So there's a professor, Jim Lattin, and Peter Levine from A16Z, who taught a class together on building out a sales organization. There's also Huggy Rao, who's a professor there, and Sujay Jaswa, who's the former CFO of Dropbox. They taught a class together on people operations. And so, those classes were really helpful because it was a balance of academic and real operations. Mm-hmm. So that helped me guide through a lot of the issues that startups usually endure. And then lastly, I think if you ask anyone about Stanford GSB, they always mention a class called Touchy Feely. Yes. And I would say I got the biggest value out of the interpersonal dynamics of that. So, it's a unique opportunity where you can get external feedback on every little aspect of how you interact with people. And as finance professionals, you don't always get that because it's a fast-paced industry. There's sort of a, figure that you try to appear to be, in private equity or investment banking. And so this was one of those classes. And unfortunately, it was one of the last classes that we took. I would have loved to take it at the beginning of the program, but it shaped me to be a better individual. And if you look at, finance leaders' total profile, it's not only experience, but also that interpersonal dynamic component. And so for me, that was important. And yes, what are the effects of it long term? As I mentioned, the network is critical. Whether we're running diligence on a company, I'm able to reach out to folks in LATAM or across the US to use their connections to diligence. Additionally, I'd say one of the other benefits was using that operational experience I mentioned from the classes. I had no experience building a sales org, but then going into it, now I'm able to say, oh, this is what a sales org normally looks like. So let's incorporate that or think about changing that strategy. So I think it's helped on multiple fronts.
Two big kind of more recent, longer arcing career questions for you, because
yes,
you've done a bit of both. First, on the operating partner side, I think that is a job that in some ways I feel like has the most unique blend of a lot of people want to do it, but nobody really knows what it is.
Yep.
Could you just talk a little bit more about how you found yourself in that role, some experiences or, what you did or who you met or kind of like what helped propel you into that seat?
Yeah. So I'll give a little bit of explanation and also some background there. But, generally operating partners are focused on advising portfolio companies within certain silos of operations. So a lot of times you hear about that in marketing, in sales, in HR, a little less in finance. I would say the finance operating role tends to be less common in Silicon Valley, mostly because startups usually need the most assistance at the beginning with marketing or sales. But I think finance is often overlooked. And that's what I'm always screaming from the mountaintops here is, by the time I see your Series A or Series B financials, if your burn was too high, if your metrics are out of whack, if COGS are misaligned, for example, or the company hired too quickly, these are all things that can be avoided by just having that strategic finance person in place and having attention and focus on that much earlier on. How did I find myself in this role? So have a deep passion for finance operations, but also enjoy almost the academic side of it. So research, what makes a good CFO based on the quant side, on the qualitative side. And then also have that sort of consulting feeling where don't want to just help one company, want to help a portfolio of companies, take best practices from one, move them to another. And so after spending some time, building out a finance organization at that natural resources company, but also being head of finance at a Series B company, I had the baptism by fire, had the experience of building from 0 to 1, knowing the best tools, seeing the issues. And the one thing I'd say is every time I drop down into a company, it's sort of the same issues, just in a slightly different form. And so I really have a passion for just operations, as I mentioned, and being able to pattern match and find those best processes. But the one thing I would say is a lot of people who go into it or try to go into it view it as a stepping stone into the investing world. I would say it's not that. So if you want to go onto the operating side, you have to have the intention of, I want to focus solely on operations and never make that leap into the investment side. And so if you eventually want to make it into investment side, that's just a consideration to make is, do I want to go down the operating path or down the investor side? And will this help advance my career with that? And, I think the one thing that VCs do not like is someone who is trying to use that operating role to break into investing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because it's one of those conditional probability things where, the existence of that transition having happened in the past,
yeah,
is not evidence of ease of pursuing that transition.
Yep.
There's definitely some number math that goes into that.
Yeah.
Similar question for the CFO role of just, let's say you're someone, maybe you're, starting your career, whether it's investment banking or, maybe you just started in a startup or in consulting, but you aspire to, a C-suite role and thinking
Sure.
about CFO as an option. Any particular experiences or things, that banking is probably important, but, besides that you felt was meaningful for you?
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, look both in the quant side and qualitative side for this. So on the quant side, I did research where I pulled basically all Series C financings year to date, plus a little bit longer, and then triangulated using databases, work history, LinkedIn, combined with a lot of hours of analysis, and was able to pull basically the identifiers for and qualifiers for CFOs. And so, when you talk about the path to CFO, historically, CFOs were someone who really had a focus on reporting what happened. But today, CFOs are focused not only on that, but also, pulling in data from across your organization and tying that with financial data to help make strategic decisions going forward. So with that in mind, it wasn't too surprising when the data came through that only 25% of CFOs had a CPA. And I think if you would have said that 2 decades ago, you would have gotten a little bit of a shock. But along the same trend, 50% of them had an MBA. So, going back to our discussion of, why did you choose to go down the MBA path? I didn't know that data at the time, but now I'm sort of glad I did, although it's still a coin flip in that sense. But if I compare that to a head of finance or VP of finance, only 25% of them have an MBA. So just looking at those figures in a vacuum, you could assume that MBA helps to make you a more qualified candidate. But, again, there's so many independent variables that play a role. It's tough to make a definitive conclusion off just 2 data points. And the other things that help qualify you are having former public company experience. So a lot of companies that are hiring CFOs in the Series C stage have that IPO on the horizon, or hoping to at least. And so having that former public company experience helps you fill that role of being able to speak to public investors, running that whole banking process leading up to the IPO. But, it wasn't 100%. It was still close to 40% who had that experience. And then the last thing, I think there's this almost tenure-based aspect to it of how many years of experience do you have. So for looking at finance directors or head of finance, it was about 10 years of experience. VPs were about 13 years and CFOs were 17 years. But I saw a decent amount of range in that, really from 15 to some even up to 30 years in the CFO position. But the stat, also that stood out to me is if you want to be a CFO, I think a lot of times we talk about what qualifiers do you need, what education do you need. There's also a strategic aspect to it. So when I looked at these CFOs, 84% of them were hired externally, so not developed internally. So if you want to be a CFO, I think you also have to look outside your organization to find those positions. because the historical way of, starting as an analyst, working your way up, eventually become CFO after 20 years, we just don't see that. These companies are growing way too fast and they have to hire in. And so only 45% of these CFOs had previous CFO experience. So from a strategic point of view, your best way to get there is to look externally. And then I mentioned there's also the qualitative side, which is equally as important. So, what makes a good CFO? And I think this really matters if it's an early stage company, mid stage, or late stage. On the early stage, you need someone who's really going to roll up their sleeves and focus on all aspects of the organization. Mid to late stage, you need that component, but also managerial skills. Now you have a full team that you're building out. You need to be able to delegate, trust. And in late stage, it's that middle stage, but amplified by 10x. And you're answering a lot more questions. It's a bigger ship to steer. But the qualities that I see, regardless of stage, is just having integrity. So owning up to issues, being frank about the position. Another thing, and this will sound like a weird phrase, but being a good seller of information. And so what I mean by that is being able to answer questions and convey information in a way that reflects honesty, but also positivity on the company and its outlook to employees, investors, and debtor. And then I think this is true with any C-suite role. You have to complement the composition of the C-suite. So if the CEO spends too freely, you need probably a more frugal CFO. If the CFO or CEO is not hiring anybody, you need CFO who can nudge them to spend a little bit of money for growth. So that's a little bit of the quant side, the qualitative side. But, I think as you and I know, a lot of it is, how does that marry together? How does that form? And then where is the company if it's in its life cycle? And those things all have to come together perfectly.
It really is amazing to reflect on how the CFO role has evolved so much, and also the flux that it's in a lot of ways. I mean, you're totally right that 30 years ago, being a CFO meant a very specific thing. And now just talking about the range of, things that are increasingly in the purview of a CFO, whether it's kind of strategy and kind of like, business and managerial savvy versus, financial modeling and forecasting savvy versus understanding, the accounting and, and the historicals versus then I think increasingly too, I'm curious what you think about this, but on the data side, as software proliferates, as data becomes more accessible, now thinking about, the data analytics side of, having more of that mindset to drive some of these strategic decisions.
Yeah, no, I think that's a key component that's often overlooked. And, one of the benefits was I took a few data classes again with my MBA. And so got pretty fast with running SQL queries, fast with using Tableau, Looker, other data tools. And so when I was head of finance at the Series B company, a lot of it was marrying data across the organization with financial data. And so we had a few different motions, not only with customer acquisition, but also just with our pricing strategy and a few other components. And so was able to tie that data to our customer acquisition costs, understand, are we spending too much? Are we, is our lifetime value high enough? But then also correlating different pricing packages that people were shown to acceptance rates and understanding what we would need there. And then looking at our sales team and pulling data from there to understand what does our pipeline look like, being able to forecast that. There's now tools for that are significantly better, but being able to combine all those data sources to then forecast more accurately, I think is an important skill. And so when I had to make my first hire for the team, I didn't hire another finance person. I actually hired a data person. And that just helped make sure that what was feeding into the data that I was using was clean. And that's, I think, one of the hardest parts with most startups. Whenever I jump in, you realize, their Salesforce data has changed a few times. They've changed the field, they've changed the stages. And so things like even just pulling what did the pipeline look like a year ago becomes difficult. And a lot of the tools today pull from those data sources. So making sure those are clean at the beginning is extremely important for making you successful in the future in the finance role.
And then I'll maybe ask a slightly different tack on this question, which, we've talked about the breadth of skills that are important for finance leaders. A corollary to that question is, for a 19-year-old, 20, 21-year-old who wants to acquire all these things, the when of it all, just in a world where, those investment banking jobs are so competitive. And, like one question I get often is, hey, do I need to like take a computer science class and learn some Python for my investment banking interviews? And I'm curious, maybe you're welcome to disagree with me, but I feel like where I typically migrate with that is like, no, not, it's interesting, but like not for banking, but it's still helpful, but just like later. So I'm curious, but you're welcome to disagree with me, but I'm curious how you think about the when and the timing of starting to stack all of these skills.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I agree with you. From investment banking, you don't need to know it at the onset. I think it's a job where you come in and it's almost like the military, where they train you to be the soldier you need to be. But yeah, I think building that talent stack is important, and thinking about timing is difficult because your job tends to be demanding. Even if you want to go to business school, you have to take the GMAT. And so when do you study for that? And so you work a grueling week, and then on the weekend, you're studying. Every night when you come home, you're studying for the GMAT. And it's one of those things where you have to sacrifice today a little bit to reap those benefits in the future. And that's often a hard trade-off, where you skip going to that dinner, you skip hanging out with your friends on the weekend to really build that talent stack. I'd say, map out where you want to be. And then from there, you can focus on what does a good talent stack look like. So do you need to know Python if you're going to be, an FP&A person at XYZ company in natural resources? Probably not. If you're going into the tech world and you want to focus more on strategy and you're analyzing a lot of data sources and working with X, Y, and Z, potentially then it's more important. And I think the benefit now is you can learn a lot of these skills online for almost, maybe $5 to $10 with a lot of these. So, for example, when I was starting off, I wanted to really understand how QuickBooks worked. So got QuickBooks online, downloaded classes from experts, and then built my own general ledger, built, different functionality, did journal entries myself, just so I could really understand how the controller and accounting side worked with it. And then, so I think building that talent stack is crucial, but make sure you're building the right talent stack. So don't spend your weekends and forego hanging out with friends for something that will play no factor in your future job. But I think one of the things you tend to notice is, regardless of what you learn, it somehow helps you in the future.
Well, Eddie, thank you so much for joining us. This has been really interesting. I love some of these frameworks that we set up, and just, for volunteering your time. I know you're a busy guy, so really appreciate it.
Of course. Yeah. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to email me. It's just Eddie@Thomvest.com. That's EDDIE. Happy to help anyone out, discuss further. And then also I tend to post a lot of research, so feel free to follow me on LinkedIn as well if you're interested in learning more.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Craig.
That does it for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. And remember to check out our website, breakingintofinancepodcast.com, where you can submit questions, join our Substack to stay up to date on new content releases, and much, much more. We'll see you next time.